Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Queen's MCR, I would like to welcome you all to the Angevin Talks and to thank you very much for attending. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Dambisa Moyo, our inaugural speaker for the Angevin Talks. Dambisa, we are delighted that you have agreed to include us in your very busy schedule. Thank you so much. Before we begin, we would like to extend our special thanks to Dr. Robin Walker, who was instrumental in working with the MCR in coming up with the name, the Angevin Talks. Robin, we are all very grateful to you. Briefly, the name Angevin has the meaning of from, or of, or pertaining to Anjou. So the word Angevin references our first foundress, Queen Margaret of Anjou. To hear a more fulsome explanation, please watch the video from Dr. Walker on our social media pages, where he explains the origin of the name Anjou. In addition, we would like to extend our thanks to James Smith and Sneha Batista, who are both current members of the MCR and master's students in architecture. Thank you both for designing the wonderful logo for the talks. In their own words, James and Sneha have aimed to create something quintessential to Queen's College and have taken their inspiration from the President's Lodge. The result is a culturally rich logo embodying the architectural language of the lodge and its unique and historic facade and cloisters that have welcomed many speakers to Cambridge University. It is also our hope that in the near future, the talks can safely also be hosted in person at the lodge. To the members of MCR that have tirelessly worked on the rollout of the Angevin Talks with me, you all have our thanks and admiration. Before we begin, please be advised that this evening's talk will be live streamed to YouTube and will be recorded for those who were unable to attend this evening. Cameras and microphones will be enabled for the Q&A session that follows, and I encourage everybody to turn on their cameras and add their questions to the chat function. Dambisa, welcome to the Angevin Talks. You grew up in Zambia and also spent some of your early years in the US. What was it like, and how did this stimulate your passion for global affairs?
So first of all, I just want to thank you, Anna, for hosting this most amazing platform, even in the depths of such a challenging period. Your vision and the vision of the people that you've worked with at Queen's and more generally in the MCR, obviously is an important piece to making sure that we continue to think about the future and not sort of wallow in sort of a problem identification in the here and now, but really think about what the future might hold. I also want to just take a moment to thank the hosts, so the people from the MCR in particular, for all the background work and running around that you've done in setting this up.
Thank you very much.
It's a big question, Anna. Regarding my origin, yes, I was born and raised in Zambia, Southern Africa. For people who don't know, Zambia is one of the poorest countries in the world. At the time of my birth, it was a country where, my birth was in 1969, but the country gained independence in 1964. And at the time of the independence in 1964, which Zambia was a British colony, there were 24 doctors in the country for a very large multi-million population. We can fast forward to today, and Zambia's population, when I was growing up, was around 10 million, and it's now closer to 30 million by some estimates. I have had a very fortunate and wonderful upbringing. I look back I'd like to think it's midlife, but I just turned 52, so I may be past the half-point mark already. But the point being, I look back and I'm very grateful to have been raised in Africa for a whole host of reasons. And perhaps most importantly, I was raised in a family where cynicism was sort of looked down upon, and we've always been told to look at the glass half full. And my experiences despite the challenges of trying to eke out a living on a day-to-day basis on a continent where economic growth is slow and geopolitics are vibrant, shall we say, is something that has been priceless and a basically defining piece of my career and my life, and will always be.
Thank you for that. You are known as a preeminent thinker and one who influences key decision makers in strategic investment and in public policy. Yet, you did your undergraduate degree in chemistry and then transitioned into the world of finance with your MBA. Could you share your path through this change with us?
Yes, look, the truth of the matter is that I got a little bit bored in the sciences. I think the world of science is fascinating. It's a necessary piece of the success for human progress. But at the time that I was doing my undergraduate degree, first of all in Zambia, at the University of Zambia, I was actually the only girl in my class, was mainly men. And I really enjoyed the sciences, but I think the moment where I decided I wasn't going to go to medical school, it seemed to me that chemistry was not going to be the long-term career choice for myself. Growing up in a place like Africa, the connections between geopolitics and economics and business and industry and social challenges are so intertwined and so much a part of your day-to-day existence that I was always entranced and in love with questions of geopolitics and global trends, many of which have defined and sort of calibrated the work that I've done since my first book, over 10 years ago now. And so if I look back at that transition, I think growing up in a place where sciences are seen as critically important, but perhaps are relatively underfunded and maybe slightly detached from day-to-day living, I was very keen to transition into economics and public policy, which is what I ended up doing.
Well, we're all the better for that.
I hope so. Some might disagree, Anna.
You are the most glamorous person I know. You love fashion, you're passionate about fitness and exercise, you love watching tennis and basketball, and you work extremely hard. I think you're perfect.
I do too, for what it's worth. No, seriously, I'm joking.
How do you balance it and find equilibrium? Is there anything you don't do well?
Anna, a lot of things. And the truth be told, I make a lot of mistakes and I fail at a lot of things, but we live in a world where nobody really advertises their weaknesses and failures. And so, if you actually spoke to my friends and family and my husband, I think they would have a long list of the shortcomings that I have. But I very much view that as being a driving force for excellence and trying to improve in every aspect that I can. I was talking to a former boss of mine who actually was my boss when I worked at Goldman Sachs. And I said, it's so interesting because if people just look at a resume or a Wikipedia page, they never fully understand just how many mistakes and disappointments and letdowns you have in life. So, I appreciate the compliment and, I hope that my epitaph reads what you've just said. But the reality is I make a lot of mistakes and I'm very, very grateful for friends and family who give a lot of critical advice that sort of resets me on the straight and narrow, more often than I think most people realize.
Your academic journey took you to a Master's of Public Administration at the Harvard Kennedy School, and then to your DPhil at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, which we won't hold against you.
I can't be perfect.
What are the main takeaways from your early education that shaped your path to where you are today?
So, Anna, I think a lot about the fact that 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging markets. And as we think about the global issues that we continue to contend with and think about the future of the world and human progress, I keep coming back to the fact that for me, education has been completely transformative. It's always interesting to look back, especially at this point in my life, and to realize that very often I sort of stumbled into things that turned out to be good decisions, but they weren't really made by design. I was very lucky in many respects. And there were countless opportunities for me to cock up and make enormous mistakes. And so I'm grateful that I didn't. And somehow on balance, despite many mistakes and many letdowns, I've kind of ended up in a good place. But for me, education is critical. And if you look at some of the statistics, McKinsey, the global consulting firm, did a wonderful report not too long ago, talking about how the underinvestment in Blacks and Latinos in particular in the United States was so damaging that by 2050, it would cause the United States to be in a permanent recession. If you look more generally at things like the OECD PISA statistics. So this is the Program for International Student Assessment. It's a survey that comes out every couple of years, surveying students 9 to 14-year-olds around the world in mathematics, in sciences, and in reading. It's rankings, and it's quite distressing to see that education standards in places like the United States, UK, and in Europe, these are the leading countries of the world in terms of economics, and also many other representations are sliding down in terms of these areas. And yet education is absolutely critical in terms of not only how we will innovate to solve some of the very big challenges around health and education, but education is critical for how we engage with each other, particularly at a time when there's really aggressive mood music around cancel culture, us versus them, and sort of a much more divisive and balkanized world more generally. So I can't underscore enough, if I were made king for a day, or queen in this case, and I'll give a nod to queens in that case, I think I would really, really push the education agenda in a much more aggressive way than perhaps is desired in a world where people think they have the choice on how they educate, but also I'd push the agenda much more aggressively than we have as a sort of society in general.
Yes. I really love a particular phrase that you use. The following: in business, progress is never linear. Success is never inevitable. It applies to companies, but also to all of us as individuals living our daily lives. What do you have in mind when you say those words?
I really love that framing, and really want to underscore what you just said, that the point about life and business, in this case business, but life more generally not being linear, I worry a lot is something that we don't teach. And I think embedded in the phrase or the expression that you just outlined is the point that we should be almost embracing of our failures and our limitations, because I think understanding and identifying them can make us better and make us stronger. So, I think about the businesses on which I serve on the board of directors. They can't succeed over hundreds of years as they've done without really taking a good look at where they fail and where they aren't doing as well as they could do. And I think the more that we think about progress as not being a straight line, but also thinking about failures as an opportunity to get better, I actually think the better off we would be. Yes, I don't at all believe that success is linear and in life or in business. And there are countless examples in my own life where I thought quite erroneously that I deserved something, or I was not being given an opportunity that I felt I was almost entitled to. And that's how arrogant I was when I was younger. And you realize as you get older that actually it wasn't the right time, and that there was an opportunity to get better, to sort of strengthen your muscles and how you think about things and think about the world more generally. And that was, and very often those opportunities came round again 10 years later. And I, of course, would call my parents and say, I can't believe it. Do you remember when I was rejected by X? They've just called me 10 years later. And I think that those aspects of concepts of time, concepts of a lack of linearity in how life evolves, I think are really important lessons that unfortunately we don't really learn in the school environment. I think we hopefully learn at home or in our social networks, but perhaps there's an opportunity for more formalized education on these areas.
Very important, because, you know, our audience this evening are really, you know, a lot of the undergrads and the MCR, and very important to stay the course, because it's not an exact science, right? We need to all just keep at it, even if as the things don't come in on time or as we would prefer, but they do come when we stay the course. You are now the author of 4 New York Times best-selling books. The launch of your first book, Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working and How There is a Better Way for Africa, in 2009, propelled your career into the public eye. How did you make the decision to write a book? And what was the catalyst at the time?
So first of all, I think it's an ongoing joke for people who are in my class growing up in primary school in Zambia, because I have always been the worst writer, and I thank God for editors. Sometimes I think they over-edit, but nevertheless, I'm very grateful, because I have always been the worst writer, certainly in our family, but also in my classes as a student in Zambia. But really, you know, maybe this is a broader lesson for all of us, given the world of sort of cancel culture, as I mentioned a moment ago, and this idea of us versus them. You know, a lot of my career success, if you want to call it that, has really emerged because somebody who didn't actually look like me really took an interest in an idea that I had, and really you know, forced and encouraged me in a very catalytic way to package, in this case, Dead Aid. And, you know, maybe just to say explicitly that in the case of Dead Aid, I was very lucky to meet a man named Lord Philip Gould, who sadly passed away many years ago. But, you know, really at a lunch, he asked me what my view was about the world. And I launched into this diatribe about how upset I was that the African continent hadn't progressed. And I was working at Goldman Sachs at the time, and looking across the Goldman Sachs trading floor, there were people from Turkey and Argentina and all across Asia, and there were almost no Africans. And I said, this is absurd. You know, Africa represents 20% of the world's population, and yet was underrepresented in these very, very, you know, august and, you know, important institutions. And he said, well, why do you think that is? And I said, I think it's because of aid and how aid makes things worse. And I know it's with good intentions that people want to share aid, but really it's quite harmful. But the point being that by the end of that, he said to me, why don't you write a book? And I was kind of dumbfounded, because he pushed me not only to think about really packaging and my views, but also to think not just about, here's a long list of, you know, a long list of problems, but to also really articulate what the solutions were. So people who have read my books will know that I follow the same formula. The first half of the book is about problem identification, talking about why something that's a great idea, like helping poor people, for example, by giving them some aid support, actually has such negative outcomes. But that's not good enough. We need to also say, well, here's a list of things we should be doing instead. And all my books have that format, and Dead Aid did too. So, here's a guy who's was much older than I was, white, male, not from the developing world, certainly not from Africa, and really was very transformative in the opportunity for me to write that book, and to really change my career path quite materially. I was at Goldman Sachs when we had the meeting. It took me basically 4 years to get a publisher, and an agent, and then a publisher, and it really was a turning point in terms of my career. I basically ended up leaving Goldman Sachs, and had a lot of opportunities, such as joining corporate boards that emerged on the back of the success of that. So, pay attention. That sort of relatively innocuous question could be really material in terms of influencing life changes.
Yes, and my comment, as you say, would be stay open. It's very important that we're in the present moment and we really think about what's in front of us, that, so things don't pass us by.
That's right. Very much so.
You and I recently had a discussion of why we make suboptimal decisions, even if we are competent and successful. Why does this happen, even in later life?
Yeah, so, Anna, I go through these waves. I love reading. I read a lot of books, and a lot of them are not even in my field, because I'm very much about this sort of, I think the term is kind of bandied around a lot, but continuous learning. I always feel like there's no end point. And just last week, someone was telling me that Henry Kissinger, who had his last formal job, I think in the early 1970s, who's now 98, is writing 2 books, a book on leadership and a book on AI. And I thought, oh my God, because my birthday was February 2nd. I just turned 52, and I thought I was going to be done with my next book, but clearly there's a lot of runway. So the point about suboptimal decisions in the frame of life, and this sort of arc of life being really about experiences, I think is really important, because when I think about my own career choices, but also about my board experiences and how companies succeed or fail over multiple periods, it boils down to judgment. It really does. It really is that singular thing about making the right choices given the full amount of information that we have at a particular point in time. And so you're right that even at older ages, people make mistakes. I was very struck just the last couple of weeks how somebody whose music I've admired and enjoyed over many decades, Bruce Springsteen, at the age of 71. And for those of you maybe who might not be aware, but every year in the United States, there's a big, it's kind of like Premiership League, or at least Americans think it is, but it's kind of not the same thing, is it? Called the Super Bowl. And at the Super Bowl this year, Bruce Springsteen had an amazing a commercial advertisement for Jeep cars. And within 24 hours, there's a massive scandal about how he had been caught drinking and driving and arrested by the police. And I was really struck by that, because here's somebody who has had a phenomenal career. And by the way, just to be absolutely clear, I do not know all the details. Don't send me hate mail. I don't know all the details. I know what I've read in the papers. And yes, the papers may be biased, etc. I'm just giving you a broad sweep of the story. A 70-year-old male who's incredibly successful, does this phenomenal commercial advertisement on television for the Super Bowl, and then he's caught drunk driving. Don't know his family circumstances and the challenges, but nevertheless, it feeds into this question about decision making and choices that we make. And you're never out of the woods is the key point here. And it doesn't. I think there is. And you and I, Anna, were talking about the fact that you get to a point where you think, oh, gosh, I'm now 50 and I didn't, wreck my parents' car, or I wasn't found slobbering drunk under a table. and there's a whole list of things that you might have, wasn't arrested, etc. And there are a whole host of things that you think, phew, I managed to get myself not into trouble. I managed to get to this point. But life is not sort of an endpoint. There are always vulnerabilities that we make wrong and suboptimal choices at every node of decision making that we have to, where we encounter. And as you know, Anna, my views around suboptimal decisions, which I should say I've just shamelessly stolen from my husband, because he's very much into decision making. But he makes the point that if you make a suboptimal decision, the next decision and the one subsequently are necessarily suboptimal. You're essentially stacking suboptimal decisions. And so I think a lot about that. I think about why we make bad decisions. Very often is we don't have the full suite of information that we would like to have to make better decisions. But also sometimes it's expedience, it's carelessness, and sometimes it's basically not really taking the time to reflect on about second order effects or consequences of a decision made in a snap judgments made at a particular time. So decision making, I'm not at all going to claim is easy, but I'm become much more attuned to the traps that one can face or one faces from really not taking a moment to think a little bit more about the choices that we make on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, and what follows is, it doesn't matter how many other good decisions you make thereafter, they always tend to be watered down because Correct. Of this, suboptimal situation that you've put yourself in the first place. But I agree. Ultimately, probably we're converging on being careless and not thinking. Yeah.
And it's probably worth just saying that none of this is fatal. I think it's really important for all of us to understand that we can always reset. I mean, I hate to even look at my report card when I was a student in Zambia. I mean, people who are there will really understand that, somebody who has not great grades. I mean, look at President Obama. I think he's been very upfront about his own grades and his performance at school. So nothing is fatal. And I think Winston Churchill said it very eloquently about the fatality of essentially of choices. They're not fatal, but I think the point is that we need to identify when we're making those suboptimal decisions and as quickly as possible remedy those choices so that you can get back onto a path of more sort of better decision making.
You are and have been a member of many very influential boards. Gender and ethnic diversity is fundamental to our society. Where do you think we are right now? Where are we going? And are we making progress, in your opinion?
It's a wonderful question. I wrote a book, an article on LinkedIn a number of years ago called, Women, if we want to progress, we need to put our hands up. And I look at that document, I think it's maybe 5 or 6 years old now, but the introductory paragraph basically outlines a lot of successes that we've had regarding women. And I would go as far as saying that as disappointed as we are at a very macro level on the gender and racial progress, I think we should look at and accept that there has been significant progress in some areas. Nowhere near as much as we would like to see, but I think we do need to every now and then take a step back and say, okay, we are doing better than we did 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so when I look around the world today and I think about gender, for example, basically we've had female political leaders. There have been many studies talking about how female political leaders have done phenomenally well through COVID. But even beyond that, you've had 2 prime ministers in Britain who've been women. Obviously Germany. In Africa, we've had 3 presidents, female presidents. We had female presidents in South America and Asia. This is where the United States needs to catch up. I don't know what's happening there, but never mind. And then you think about business landscape, the business landscape, and you have senior women as CEOs in old technology, in new technology, in automobiles, in banking. And so, yes, we may be frustrated at the pace of progress, but to say there's no progress would also be wrong. I actually am pretty heartened. When I joined my first board 10 years ago, I was the only woman on all 3 boards that I served on. And if you think about that for a minute, I was on the boards of 3 companies that were trading on the FTSE in the United Kingdom, in Britain, and they were essentially could not find or did not find a woman. And it was only me as an African woman showing up in Britain who was put on the board. And in retrospect, it looks as absurd. It sounds as absurd as it really was. That would not happen today. All the boards on which I serve have not just myself, but other women. And I think I'm making a lot of comments right now about women, but I think the point also extends to a lesser extent to race, and I'll come to race in a moment. But with respect to gender, my message is, back in the day, people might have felt sorry for you as a woman and said, well, we need more women in the boardroom or more women in the C-suite. That's not the world we're in right now or moving toward. And by that, I mean there is a more and more every day, an increasing pool of women who are phenomenal in their careers, in the opportunities that they have had, in the perspectives that they bring to the boardroom. And more and more I say, especially when I speak at women's events, that the competition is no longer, oh, it's the white guy, who's had a privileged background, as people would say in shorthand. It's now a woman sitting right next to you who maybe comes from China or from Nigeria or from Argentina, who has worked very hard on her craft and is now incredibly well equipped to contribute to help solve some of these big challenges that not just business but public policy and civil society are grappling with. On the race issue, I'll just say that I'm optimistic because I do believe that we've been able to turn the sort of tide with women's representation. And there are many reasons I could see how we can almost just cookie cutter take down what we did to improve our statistics with women representation and apply it to minority groups, not just Blacks, but Latinos, Asians, etc., other groups. But I'm also pretty heartened that the discussions that I'm involved with around race as well as gender, but more race now, are much more ambitious than they were when I was starting off at Goldman Sachs in 2001. When I worked at the World Bank and Goldman Sachs, there was a lot of goodwill. And people would say we want to attract, promote, and retain women and minority groups. But clearly not enough was really being done. But now, we certainly myself on boards and others are putting a lot of pressure on organizations to say, you know what, it's not good enough to send X thousand pounds to a university to support a community program or to support a few scholarships. We want to see a real broad-based attack of this problem. Companies that are paying enormous amounts of money to host their conferences in big cities, they should insist that the cities show them what the trajectory on education and healthcare and criminal justice issues are, and how those are evolving in the cities that the municipalities that they are responsible for. Otherwise, why should companies put their businesses headquartered in these cities or even host events in those cities? We're demanding that companies now not just think about recruitment as being the only lens to judge success or failure of bringing minorities and women into an organization. They need to think more about our subcontractors, our suppliers, who's managing our pension money, who are the accounting firms that are advising us, the law firms that are advising us? Do those companies, or even the banks, when they come to pitch us for M&A business or transactions, do those companies have representation? And we can put pressure to bear in those areas as well. So, I should conclude that I'm actually serving as one of 10 commissioners in the UK on the UK Race Commission, which we very shortly will have a report out on what we have found data-wise vis-a-vis minorities in the UK context. We've focused on 4 groups: education, healthcare, criminal justice, and employment. And I think we should all take this as an opportunity to upgrade meritocracy. Nobody wants to feel like they're in a place because they're a woman or because they're Black. It's about encouraging talent and human capital. It's in everybody's interest for society that everybody has a good opportunity, but businesses specifically cannot succeed. I believe will not be able to succeed if they don't broaden the lens around where they're sourcing talent.
Completely agree. I see it as a collective and individual responsibility.
That's
and
right.
Your point,
yes, absolutely.
Sachs a year ago said, we will not take any company public without adequate representation of diversity on those boards. And I commend them for that.
Yeah, I mean, the truth of the matter is we cannot expect people to buy our goods and services. So I love to give, I'm not on the board of Coca-Cola, but I give the example of Coca-Cola. So if the board of Coca-Cola has no diversity, no women on it, how can they know how best to market Coca-Cola to a Latino guy who's 18 or an African woman who's 50? We have to more and more tap into these differences, and it's in the interest of the business. It doesn't make sense to not appreciate that these aspects are part and parcel of how we do business and how we succeed as society longer term. But as I said, there's no sort of prize for not focusing on meritocracy. I have yet to meet a woman or a minority who says, I actually want favors. I don't want to work for things. I think what we're looking for is a level playing field, and organizations from Cambridge and Queen's College to businesses at large should want to get the best talent, regardless of what packaging they come in. And so it really is important on all of us. As you say, it's a collective as well as an individual important thing to do.
Dambisa, you're known to regularly run marathons.
Yeah.
Is running a mental as well as a physical game for you? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I'm laughing because I always say to people that, I said, don't get excited because I'm African and that I'm running a marathon, because I bring down the average. I am in the back. It doesn't matter. I always end up really far in the back when it comes to the end, but I do love marathon running. I was very sad. I've run London Marathon a number of times, New York Marathon a number of times. They're my 2 favorites. Run, I don't know, hundreds now of half marathons, but I was very sad in 2020. It sounds very sort of a very elite problem to have, but I was very sad to not be able to run a marathon in 2020. More optimistic this year. I love it because it looks like an individual sport, but it's absolutely not. There's so much dependence on support, and I mean that physical support, but also learning, being able to go on social media or on internet to get information about other people's experiences. It's such a community type of endeavor. And then, as I've said to you, the day of a marathon, just having community support. I think for both New York and London, millions of people show up in cities where usually you're engage with people in the city, and they're very harsh and brash, and they don't want to have time for you. But the day of the marathon, people are out there handing out sweets and biscuits and, cheering you on. There's just something about humanity coming together. It is a long-term endeavor that you have to break down into bite sizes. And it's also a classic example of a place where suboptimal decisions come to catch up with you. Yeah, I could go on and on about marathon running. I've learned so much about business as well, and my own career from marathon running. It is a phenomenal experience. And even if you don't want to run it, may I just encourage you, you can walk 42 kilometers or 26.2 miles and really just derive an enormously amazing experience from it.
Dambisa, we have a lot of Q&A, but there are a couple of last questions.
Okay.
That I'd like. So we have a stock market at all-time highs, disconnected from the real economy, and with the pandemic severely exacerbating inequality. What, in your opinion, is the most critical issue facing the global economy today?
So you're right, Anna. Income inequality has worsened for many countries. And in fact, I would hazard a guess, and there's a lot of early data showing that things are likely to get worse. I actually just wrote an article. People are interested about the risks of a K-shaped recovery. This is the idea that after COVID, we'll see a sort of split, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. The World Bank estimates there are about 150 million people who have actually slipped into extreme poverty because of COVID. To put that in context, for the last 20 years, the World Bank has said that they've only seen real progress around reducing the number of people who live in extreme poverty. But your question, I think a lot about this question of what's the most important thing. We're grappling with so many issues: healthcare access, education, concerns around digitization, demographic shifts. Then 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging markets, as I mentioned earlier. But those are precisely the places where economic growth has actually slowed in a material way. Developing countries have relied on for aid, for example, are also struggling. The UK growth rates around 1.2 to 1.4%. Germany, even before COVID hit in earnest, posted 0% growth in 2019 Q4. So real issues around growth, income inequality, demographics, digitization, climate change, big one. Obviously, there are lots of questions now about, is climate change going to supplant, or will it be supplanted by the urgent issue of healthcare and vaccinations, etc., and therefore be moved back further? Debt. I mean, there's a whole list of these challenges. But, Anna, I don't think we can solve any of these issues of infrastructure, which, by the way, is graded D+ in the United States, according to the American Civil Engineers. D+. You cannot have a successful economy with such a poorly rated infrastructure, on roads, railway, ports, etc. But Anna, to your specific question, what is the most important thing from my vantage point is economic growth. By saying that, I know there are a lot of people who will immediately say, well, it's actually the blind pursuit of growth that has got us into a number of challenges, including income inequality. And we should maybe have a conversation about that more extensively. But we cannot expect to solve healthcare, education, infrastructure, so these big public goods, but all the other challenges, social challenges of being able to have an effective democracies that work, which can only work if you have a middle class that's holding government accountable. You're not going to be able to have a world that's more integrated and feels more encouraged in a more globalized standards and globalized cooperation without economic growth. So for me, expanding the pie, I'm not talking about redistribution, I'm talking about expanding the growth pie, must be at the center of our continued progress and progression in terms of human progress. Just one last point to illustrate why I think this is urgent is that in order to double per capita incomes in one generation, and generation is about 25 years, you need an economy to be growing at 3%. So this is just the rule of 72. It's not special science here. And basically none of the large emerging economies, Brazil, Argentina, Russia, South Africa, across Asia, these are countries that have at least 50 million people each. None of these countries are growing anywhere close to the 3% mark that we need. I've already touched on developed economies who are also struggling to generate 3%. We're not going to be able to solve these big problems, I believe, without economic growth. So we want growth that's equitable. We want growth that's sustainable. And that's where I think we should focus a lot of our energies. And so I worry a lot about short-termism in policy. You just touched on an example of that, where the stock market is, every day you open the newspaper, it's hitting new highs. But at the same time, there are people dying on the planet who have no access to basic standards of living. Right now, the estimate's about 1.5 billion people in the world have no access to energy in a reliable fashion. And again, we have to deal with climate change as soon as possible. So that's where I would land. It's not to say that these other things are inconsequential, but I think we can't solve any of them in a world that's contracting and where economic opportunities are shrinking.
Dambisa, what do you value the most at this time in your life?
Yeah. So it's a wonderful question, because I think I'd like to think that it'll be perpetually evolving. About almost it'll be 5 years this year, my immediate younger sister died, and she was 46 when she died. And I think a lot about the fact that she didn't make it to 50. And in many ways, she was much more outgoing. She traveled abroad before I did. And so I think in that respect, time is really important to me. How we use our time, who we spend our time with, what kind of opportunities to enhance ourselves, going back to continuous improvement. How do we get better as global citizens, and in terms of using our time in a valuable way. But also, I know this sounds slightly contradictory, but I think as an artifact of my sister's passing, I also have become much more focused on thinking about the here and now, thinking about what can I do? How can I help to leave the planet in a better way than I found it? So, goes back to the broad theme that I've been touching on here. I think we're all very prone and very good at identifying problems, but very rarely do we come up with a suite of possible solutions. I'm not saying that they will definitely be the solution, but we just don't really think about solutions and how can they be equitable? How can we make things in economics? There was this term Pareto efficient. How can we make things better for everybody without them not being worse for any one person? Those type of ideas, I worry, maybe have been left on the shelf as we become much better at yelling at each other, screaming at each other, and sort of pointing fingers and identifying problems, but not really avoiding being naysayers and coming up with plans. So two things, are time, more sensitive, more thoughtful about time. I try to be, and much more thoughtful about really being here and now, present, and hopefully, happy in this moment.
Absolutely. Dambisa, what a thoughtful and fascinating conversation we've all had.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open this to Q&A. I know there's a lot of questions for you, so we beg your indulgence for a few minutes while you answer those. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Anna. You've been so superb. Thank you.
So thank you, Anna and Dambisa, for a fantastic conversation. I think everyone really enjoyed that. So we have lots of questions that have been coming through both on the Zoom and on the YouTube link. So I think if we're able to just try and keep it brief so we can just get through as many as possible in the next 8 minutes or so. If I may, I'd love to start with a question about how I think everyone really appreciated how open you are about failures, but also how positive you are about the progress we've made regarding gender equality and also equality surrounding other diversities. So I just was wondering whether you think that the people's responses to failures and setbacks, whether these responses tend to be gendered, and whether these different ways in which responding to failures contributes to inequalities in career pathways. And if you do think so, how could we maybe begin to tackle this?
Well, that's a very difficult question to ask, and I'm not sure I have a perfect answer for it. I suppose it goes back to what I just said. I think it's very easy to say, wow, here's a list of reasons I can't do it or I can't be successful. And, I was talking to Anne about this during our prep session. People could have come up with a long list of reasons I would never have opportunities on a global stage. I was born in Africa. I'm a woman, by the way, but at the time of my birth, they did not issue birth certificates to Blacks. That law only changed in 1973. And so to this day, I don't have a birth certificate. And it actually is pretty brazen. The affidavit that I have is pretty brazen because it says birth certificates were not issued to Blacks only to, and they list every race that was given a birth certificate, whites, etc. But the point just being, I could have been born in a household where people said, oh my gosh, whoa, you're a Black woman in Africa in a small country. You don't have any chance at all. And I think a lot of, people, perhaps get hamstrung by a narrative that is maybe not even in their own constructs. And I was just watching a few days ago, Hillbilly Elegy. If people haven't read the book, it's brilliant. It's about a white guy who grew up in very harsh conditions in Appalachia, the United States, which for those of you who don't know, this is sort of the West Virginia area and parts of Kentucky in the United States. Very tough environment. If you read some of the statistics around suicide rates, joblessness, drug use of opioids, etc., it is a bad hand to be dealt. But he ended up going to Yale. He's a lawyer, wrote this incredibly successful book, and so it's not a perfect answer, and I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish about it because we all have we're living with our own demons. But I would just say I don't think anybody, male or female, Black or white, should be stopped from pursuing their dreams and opportunities because of their identity or how they showed up. I do not hire people because they're Black or white or male or female. I think most companies hire people, and I should say public policy, governments are looking for people who are going to help solve the problems that the world faces. So we shouldn't try and find reasons why we can't participate in those discussions. We need everybody, all hands on deck, to help solve these problems. So it might be a wholly dissatisfying answer, but all I would say is that it's not a good enough excuse coming from somebody from Africa who's a woman who grew up in an era where it was pre-Me Too. If I can make it, I don't think we have certainly we don't have the excuses that we had back in my day to succeed.
Thank you. So just moving on, I'd like to ask David Talbot if you would like to ask your question.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, Dr. Moyo, for joining us today. I've followed your work since reading Winner Take All back in 2012 or 2013. It's always insightful and cutting edge. My two-part question really draws on your experience in trade and development. So we're obviously in the midst of a period of massive upheaval in the global economy driven by the pandemic, deterioration of US-China relations, Brexit, you name it. First, what advice are you giving to CEOs on managing supply chain resiliency? I guess a second related question, given that we're seeing trends toward deglobalization, whatever you'd like to call it. What consequences do you foresee for developing economies with models that are heavily dependent on foreign investment?
So thank you, David. Those are great questions. It's interesting. About 5 years ago, I was sort of pounding the sort of desk in my boardroom saying, we really need to think about deglobalization. And I kept getting this blank stare like, oh, Dambisa, there she is on her academic hobby horse again. And here we are now. Some might argue it was sort of an exogenous factor. COVID hit and we all were sort of asked to stay home as being the driver. But nevertheless, we are where I was worried we would end up. So just for people who aren't economists and perhaps, chomping at the bit or drooling over globalization, what are we talking about? We're talking about the movement of capital movement, this movement of investment capital over borders. We're talking about the movement of people over borders, so immigration. We're talking about globalization being part of this idea of standardization. So global standards, being all of us are sort of ascribing and agreeing to certain values. And then also as a fifth point, I'm talking about global cooperation. And all of these 5 aspects have gotten worse. For sure. Actually, I've written a number of articles. If people are interested, just send me an email, or Anna, you and I can work on maybe getting information, posting it somewhere so people can see it. But it is true that all of these areas have gotten worse, and I fear are going to get worse in a world of slow economic growth, because our policymakers, they recognize we've got long-term problems, but they're very much rewarded for short-term solutions, dealing with solutions that work today, but perhaps a long-term not very attractive. In other words, deglobalization works very well. Populism works well today, but long-term, I think it's going to be very damaging. What advice do I give? I've written a lot on this concept of the siloed world, particularly in my book, Edge of Chaos, which came out 2 years ago. And I talk about it again in the book that's coming out called How Boards Work. It'll be out May 4th. But talking about how we need to prepare and mitigate the risk for supply chain disruption, but also our inability to hire people across borders, our inability to move our goods and services, as has been challenged during COVID, inability to move capital across borders. These are real, tangible aspects of the breakdown of trade, and we're working on that right now. Vis-a-vis the emerging markets, I think it's going to be devastating. I'm from Zambia, as you know. And Zambia has been the only country, has a very notorious reputation as being the only only country to default because of COVID. There's a lot of carnage yet to come across the emerging markets in an environment of low growth, really no aid. This is my scenario I was very worried about. You can't look to the US or UK for aid at a time when their own budgets are so stretched. So I'm very worried about the emerging markets. I do think it's an opening for China, a further opening for China to really stamp its imprimatur in these countries. So sorry, I know we've gone further. I'm getting a notice here.
Thank you. So I'm very aware of the time and that we promised to stick to time. So I think unless you have time for further questions, I'll hand back to Anna for closing remarks.
I'll tell you what, I feel badly. I'll take 2 more. How's that? Would that work for everybody? I see. Okay. I see the President of Queens clapping, so I guess that means an endorsement. I'm happy to take a couple more questions.
Okay.
And then we'll create a forum for any other ancillary questions that we'll get to you.
That'd be great. That'd be super.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. So I guess to bring in everyone who's watching on YouTube, there's been a question from Eva asking whether your first degree in chemistry may have been transformative in the way in which you have such analytical thinking.
Oh, yes. The thing I love about the sciences, at least the way we were taught the sciences, is there's absolutely no ambiguity on the answer. It's most sciences, physics. And if you think about it, the next time you're driving over a bridge or you're in an airplane, I mean, those types of innovations heavily rely on science being right. You cannot be off by a millimeter. The next time, God forbid, we have to have a surgery or you're in the hands of a doctor and maybe they have your heart literally in their hand, we can't get, science doesn't have the degrees of freedom to be as wrong as perhaps other subjects. So, I think public policy and certainly economics, despite the fact that economists tend to be quite arrogant and we think that we are scientists, the truth of the matter is, we get away with a lot of wrong answers. And we got the financial crisis wrong. We didn't really, properly ascribe risk of COVID happening, and yet it's aggregate demand has shrunk, and there's been a massive blowback to the global economy. We didn't anticipate that. Where were all the economists? Where's all our modeling? So economists, I think they're scientists. They're not. I have a lot of respect, notwithstanding what I said earlier about finding it boring. I have a lot of respect for scientists. And I think we need to encourage more sciences. It's the only way we're going to get better and a better chance of solving healthcare and education and other issues I raised earlier. So yes, stick in the sciences. We need you.
Thank you. As a scientist myself, I appreciate those comments.
Give your dog a hug when you get your vaccination. Just remember that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think if we just now go to Victoria, if you'd like to unmute yourself, Victoria, ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much, Emily. Thank you, Anna, for organising this. I'm in my final year at Queen's studying geography, so I'm really happy that this has happened. And also thank you, Dr. Moyo. I've actually been reading your work since I was in high school, so when I was studying economics A-level. So yeah, full circle in my education journey. So I guess my question's around, kind of coming into young womanhood, because I'm going to be graduating this summer. What advice would you give to your What advice would you give to your 21-year-old self going into future? And is there anything you would have changed about your, young womanhood, if you could go back and change anything? Thank you.
Yes, I'd have gotten rid of a lot of boyfriends that I dated. I'll tell you that for free, but never mind. I have a sort of a view that more and more I think a lot about, which is this idea of no doesn't mean never, it means not now. And I can't emphasize that enough to young people in general, male, female, however you define yourself. Because it's really important. I think we get very, very misled by sometimes by family, by friends, by society, peer groups, whomever, about where we are. It's very hard to calibrate where you are. When I graduated, I'll give myself as an example. When I graduated my doctorate from Oxford, I honestly thought I was the bee's knees. I moved to London and I thought everybody's going to be calling me. I'm going to be invited to swanky parties. I'll be asked to talk at this place and that place. And it didn't happen. And it was a learning process for me to understand that actually you are an individual. You're kind of trapped in your own world, but there's a whole world of people who are doing their own thing. And you have to really think about being engaged in the world. So don't expect people to come to you. You need to be out there engaged in the world in a constructive way. You want people to like you, to want you to be around them and in the table at the so-called place where things are happening. But I think a lot of that has to do with what I just said, that when you meet these roadblocks, which I can guarantee you will, it's just a fact of life. You are going to be disappointed. You might not get that job that you wanted. You might not be promoted when you think you should. Don't assume that it's because you're a woman or it's because of my race or whatever. It might not just be your time. Maybe you don't know that you're not yet equipped. But you should, and by the way, you should ask for feedback. I'm not saying, hey, go and cry in a corner. You should definitely ask for feedback. But I think we need to more and more understand that there will be disappointments. And just because somebody says no to you today does not mean that you will not get to the place that you want to get. But it just might take a little bit more time, a little bit more effort, maybe more information about how to succeed. And, I have a wonderful friend in the United States, one of my best girlfriends. And she's incredibly impressive. But she's got a very sprightly personality, and she and I get into these conversations a lot. And I always say to her, you should be grateful when people give you feedback. Grateful, even if it's feedback you're not going to take. You should send them a box of chocolates, because we are living in a world now, a very dangerous world, where people who should be giving us feedback, particularly people who look like you and I, Victoria, people are scared to give us feedback now. Oh my God, it's a woman, it's Black, she might sue me, she might cry. If we continue to live in that world where people are scared to give us critical feedback, not only do we lose as individuals, because we're not going to progress, we're just not going to get better, but society is going to lose, because we will never know why we're not getting promoted. But it's partly our job as well to make sure that people are comfortable to give us the critical feedback. I mean, if you look at my own, what I call my board of directors, the people I go to for advice, they don't necessarily look like me. Some do, but not all of them. But when some of them, one of my best board members is a very good friend of mine, white male from Canada, he'll say to me to my face, Dambisa, you suck at this. He's like, I don't even know if you spend time, if you get better in this. He's like, you're great at this thing here, you're not so good at this. Why don't you outsource this? Why don't you work with somebody else on this? But for him to have the confidence that I'm not going to, you know, write an article to say this guy is a racist misogynist, means that I've had to give him the wide berth to give me that feedback and for him to feel comfortable. And I don't second, believe me, sometimes he's a guy, so sometimes he puts his foot in his mouth, but I don't second guess that when he does that, it's because he's a racist misogynist. I just think, hey, he was just being careless, he wasn't thinking. So there's not a negative agenda of that. So it's a lot of stuff I've thrown in there, Victoria. The bottom line is, don't get discouraged when you get a no. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means it's not going to happen now. And the second thing is, you don't know where your best advice and support is going to come from. That means you should be very open-minded and make sure that you give people enough comfort for them to give you critical advice. You need it. We need it. I need it. The world needs critical advice. It's marathon running. If people don't tell you, listen, you're running the first 10 miles too quickly, you're going to be in trouble the day of. And same with life. Like, if people don't give you feedback because they're scared to give you feedback, you are going to lose. The world is going to lose.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Dambisa, we are all really looking forward to reading your book, How Boards Work, and how they can work better in a chaotic world. We didn't have time to go over the contents of that. We're all very excited for it to come later in the spring. And we hope that we could invite you back, hopefully in person, for a book
signing. So. I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was absolutely fascinating and wonderful.
Thank you for your interest. All the best. Be safe out there, everybody. Thank you.
Everybody at Queen's, thank you very, very much. And thanks to everybody for joining. We look forward to seeing everybody at the next Angevin call. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Dambisa. Bye-bye.